Hmm. Well, I see myself. And as long as you can hear me, then we are good to go here. And to
All
our
right.
viewers, welcome one and all. This is the Rare Book Cafe. It's another wet Saturday across much of America. Here in Chester, South Carolina, it's cold and windy. We have had our main water main break, and so everyone is under an order to boil water for a week until they get it fixed, which creates a little bit of inconvenience in day-to-day life. It's 160 days to the next book fair in St. Petersburg, put on by our sponsors, the Florida Antiquarian Booksellers Association. I'm Lynn Thompson, the associate producer of our show, and everyone else today, unfortunately, is gone. Thorne Donnelly is at the Boston Antiquarian Book Fair, and Alan had a conflict, Steve and Edie had a conflict, but we're delighted that Todd Sommerfeld of the Miniature Book Society has been able to give us some of his time this afternoon and join us. Let me also remind you, I'll pull it up here, that the Book Fair's Limerick contest is still underway. My cursor does not want to move. I always call myself the sorcerer's apprentice when I have to produce the show because something will always go wrong. And right now it's the cursor. But there's a reminder of our Limerick contest that is coming up. Do feel free to come up with your own witticisms and send them in to win tickets to the book fair. And you can, if you are polite about it, even mention Nantucket. A couple of things that caught my eye this week in the book press. Abe Books' blog, which is called Reading Copy, has a very interesting story about spaceflight. A NASA engineer has published a book in which he's created basically a bibliography of all the books published about space travel before 1958, when it actually happened for the first time. And so it fills an interesting niche that is both professionally gratifying to him and also a useful tool for scholars. You can find that by going to Abe Books blog, and it will pop right up for you. Princeton University has a book blog as well called Notabilia, and it has an interesting article this week about private collections of books that were given to the university and have found their way into nooks and crannies all around the buildings of the campus. Some by design, some by accident, but they're a fascinating indication of the interests of alumni who were also collectors. And it underscores the importance that individuals play in literary scholarship, because without individuals who care enough to spend decades collecting 5,000 books on a single topic and then giving them to an institution, we would not have those niches of scholarly interest. Birthdays this coming week there are a number of them. Shelby Foote, the great Civil War historian and novelist, was born in 1916. Margaret Atwood, the Canadian writer, will turn 80 this coming week. Alan Tate, the critic and author, was born in 1899. Nobel laureate Nadine Gordimer, the South African writer, was born in 1923. Voltaire was born in 1694 and lived to an astonishing old age for a person of his era. George Gissing, the English writer who was one of the mainstays of the triple-decker novel in the 19th century, was born this coming week in 1857. And Harpo Marx, who actually wrote a book a biography of himself. In addition to a long career of saying nothing, was born this week in 1888. As I mentioned earlier, we are delighted to have Todd Sommerfeld with us, who is joining us from around Cleveland, I believe. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, Cleveland, Ohio. Parma, actually. Suburb.
Yeah, and the chill of the winter season has already set in up there. If all else fails today, we will talk about beard care. Because between us, we've got several feet going. But I'm delighted you could join us. And when you came on screen, you were working on something. I could hear lots of cutting and snapping and things going on. What's your project on the desk?
Yeah, sure. So what I've got going is blank journals, actually. And I can turn this around. And this is what they end up looking like.
Mm-hmm.
They've got the washi paper and a cloth spine and a built-in bookmark ribbon, 96 pages, and I've got different varieties of paper and cloth that I use, and I've got 101 of them going now. Here's about 40 pages cut, waiting to be folded, and I do that over here. I've got a little 12-inch guillotine and a bone folder, and these are trimmed and ready for sewing now. So that's what I'm doing, as well as I've got 3 published books that I'm putting together. They're all limited editions of between 75 and 200 copies, so I make a few, and as they sell out, I replenish.
And how long does it take an average book like that to be completed from start to finish?
A single copy I could probably do in about 3 hours. A run of 100 all the same, that might take a couple of months to get through everything.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like, as much as anything, the limited run of your editions is dictated by the time they take, as much as just not wanting to produce a lot of them.
I suppose that's possibly true. For me, it's a limited audience, and I know about what will sell over time, and then I'll have a few that sit on the shelf, and if somebody happenstance runs into my website or wants one, I have extras.
And you mentioned you have 3 books in the works. What are their topics?
One is a Christmas story, and here I can flip you around again and show these to you. So here they are. This is my second hardbound book, Toad Loves to Read, and it's a picture story written with the idea of a child's eye. So they're photos of actually a toad that came to visit almost nightly at the back stoop in my apartment building, and I was taking pictures of it and posting them to Facebook. But there's only so many pictures you can take of a toad. They pretty much look alike. So I was going to quit, and Facebook rebelled and demanded the nightly photos continue. So I started posing miniature books around them. And you can see that in some of those photos. I don't know how well that looks. And a story just kind of came out of it, and so that's how that came about. And that's I did not think that would be a popular item, so I just really did it for my own gratification, and an edition of 25 copies. And they were gone instantly, so I'm working on a second edition of 100. And I've got about half of them completed, and planning on doing more. they're bound in a handmade kozo paper from a local book arts community, the Morgan Conservatory. That's a specialty. They grow the kozo, which is a bamboo-like tree, on site and harvest it and make this paper. Chose it because it was bumpy and colored like a toad. So the most recent one came out last year. Let's see, there's a little better light. Is The Lonely Gingerbread Boy, and it's actually was illustrated. I worked with an illustrator. My youngest son wrote the story, so it's got more extensive text, and I think 13 illustrations, including the cover illustration. And that came out last year with hiccups. New technique I've begun working on is the gilding of the covers. So the title is in gilt on the cover.
And how do you go about that? Is that like a stamping process, or what's involved?
Yeah, it goes on a quick print, and it's a hot stamp with there I am in the mirror, with brass type. So you heat up the type, and then you impress it into the leather, or in this case cloth, and the gold sticks, and then you burnish it a second time. Up to this point, I've been using a friend's stamping machine, but I recently purchased an antiquated one that's here with all the pushins on it, this device. And when I rewire it, I'll be able to do this in-house now.
And where did you have to go to find that?
Let's turn this around so I'm back. So I find a lot of stuff actually on Facebook. I'm not sure how, but a ad came through of printing equipment for sale, and they had antique equipment from a letterpress shop well over 100 years old that had closed recently, and bought it at auction, and it turned out they're about 10 miles away from my home. So I was able to actually pick it up rather than having it shipped, which would have severely affected the cost of the piece.
Is it a heavy item?
Yeah, it's cast iron, and it stands about 3 feet tall. One man can carry it by himself, but you wouldn't want to take a journey with it. I'm going tomorrow, a little farther away down in Akron, to start disassembling a board shear, which I believe has a 42-inch blade, 42 or 48, which will make certain jobs much easier. A lot of the finer papers come in large sheets up to 3 feet, and it's difficult for me to cut it with the equipment I have now. But this will allow me to handle just about any size paper I run into, as well as the boards for the hardbound books. I have a difficulty with my limited resources in cutting things square that are thick. So that with a board shear, it'll make that almost without trouble. So upping our game at Booksby.
Is that, in layman's terms, would that be like a bigger kind of guillotine that would do?
Yeah, exactly what it is. Yeah, it's a giant guillotine, and it has a counterweight that will come down on whatever you're cutting, so it doesn't move at all.
Oh.
On the 12-inch guillotine, when you get thickness, whether it's a stack of paper or a piece of board, the covers for my books, what I use is mat board rather than book board, because it's thinner and it's also archival. I spend a little more and I get acid-free, lignin-free archival mat board for framing, and that's what my covers are made out of. But the tendency when you're cutting with a guillotine is it wants to pull on the material or push as you're cutting through it, so you end up with a piece that is not exactly square, and it makes your end product look shoddy. So we want to avoid shoddy books if we can.
And where do you sell your books?
I have a website, booksbypress.com, but I also sell by word of mouth. The miniature book community is pretty tight-knit, worldwide even. I recently sent books to England as well as Australia. I think my books are on 4 continents now.
I guess that's one blessing.
I'm sorry?
I guess one blessing of making small books is that you can send them around the world. When I was more actively involved in the book trade, I had to pretty much stop sending books to Australia because the shipping cost tended to exceed the value of the book. And so I imagine small books give you some buffer to that kind of problem.
Yeah, it's definitely less. And with the shipping envelopes that I use, I can put several things in. And whether it's 1 or 5 miniature books, it's about $13.50 to send anywhere in Australia. So that's not too bad, and it encourages people to buy more at once.
Yes. And do you find a lot of repeat business once people find your work?
I do have a few customers that have a standing order. Anything that I publish, just send it along with an invoice, which I've done. Then again, because it's a tight-knit community, people generally do tend to be interested in multiples or having a complete run of whatever you're doing.
Well, that must be a blessing to have standing orders like that. I think every author would love to be in that situation, or publisher, come to that.
Yeah, it encourages me to think up the next book. I'm really a collector, and I got into publishing through another thing that I wasn't necessarily looking to do, was lecturing on miniature books. I was asked to give a talk on the history of miniature books about 5 years ago, and I always felt that if you're going to present a topic, it would be more memorable if you can put something in the attendees' hands to take home with them. So I couldn't afford 30 or 50 or however many books I might have needed for the people attending the talk, so I decided to make my own, and that was my first book. And I thought it was going to be a one-off, but as the time went on, ideas started presenting themselves where I didn't necessarily have to look for an idea or work. What am I going to publish? I would read an article and, that would make an interesting miniature book. Or in the case with the toad, I had a series of photos, and they were cute, and a story presented itself out of the photos. So that's how that one happened. So, it's nice to know that people are looking. It's also somewhat a pressure. They're waiting for the next one. But I do it as a hobby, so I'm not terribly concerned about all of it. And actually, I think I give away more than I sell.
Oh. So we were talking earlier before the program about something else you've been involved with, and that is cigarette papers. And I'm intrigued by that because having grown up in the Carolinas, I never heard of such a thing. Can you tell us what that involves?
Well, sure. They're trade cards actually, and just like you would get a stick of bubble gum with your baseball cards, in the 19th century, when you would buy a pack of cigarettes, it would come with a trade card. And so Duke Cigarette Company was a big, I'm not even sure what really happened to them. Tobacco Anna is not my field per se, but because they had 2 series out of the dozens that they did were not just cards, but they were little booklets. And so one was a series of 50, and I'm going to flip you around one more time and I can show these things to you. Mm-hmm. So here you have, this is General Early. He was a Confederate general in the Civil War, and there's 50 of these, 25 Confederate and 25 Union, and you can see it's got these beautiful lithographs on the covers, front and back, and then there's 16 pages inside. Each one has the facsimile signature of the general, and then it goes on, and it's 16 pages of this really tiny text. Wow. That tells his life, what he did before, his exploits as a general, and his life afterwards up until this series came out in 1888. And it was published by the Duke Cigarette Company, but it was printed by this Knapp, K-N-A-P-P and Company, also of New York. Oh. And so you can see the way I have them displayed is, like I said, baseball cards. So I got a trading card binder with the archival pages, and the ones that I am lacking, I've got these little pink cards. So you see there's 50 of them. And then about a year later, 1889 or so, they came out with this second series, also 50, and this is was that John Jacob Astor. So this was poor boys who became famous, or poor boys who became rich, and other famous people. And it's the same thing. It's got this attractive lithographed cover and 16 pages of text. And you can see if you can see her, there's Sarah Bernhardt. Mm-hmm. But they did also other series that were just cards that would have the lithograph on the front and maybe a brief text of description on the back. There was Fishers and Fishermen. There were Hand Shadows. There was a series of 52 that were obviously playing cards. You had to collect them all. And probably really blacken your lungs doing it. So that's one series. There was another that was in the 1880s, and then in the 19-teens, about 1914, there was another set, and here I'm going to flip you around one more time. And these books are, well, this is Knights of Columbus. They were distributed different ways. Here we are. So we have, see there, the world's best short stories now presented with, and then it lists several different cigarettes and cigars by this company. And these were put out, there's 108 known titles in this series. It's unfortunate that these publishers, I call them disposable books, and as an overarching collection, and that covers small children's books that were stapled, like date books or calendars, mostly advertising ephemera that was designed to be used, and then you throw it out. After 1889, what do you do with your 1889 calendar? You just dispose of it. So they're fairly scarce to find because they were designed with a very short lifespan in mind. But the thing that's interesting about it is not only do miniature book collectors like these, but in the case of the Duke books, Civil War aficionados, and also tobacco anna collectors, somebody who's collecting tobacco tins and the history of tobacco is going to be interested in those as well. Or in the case of some things, I have children's books that are illustrated by Caddy. Those are popular from the illustrator's perspective as well.
And where do these tend to turn up? Are there particular places that you know to look for them, or is it purely random?
Yeah, I would go with the purely random. When people ask me, I've got about 4,500 miniature books overall. Where do you get them all? The short answer is wherever they are. So whether it's a garage sale in a suburb near Cleveland, or it's through eBay, or it's at the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair, or a purely ephemeral swap meet or flea market, or a well-known book dealer's online or published catalog, you just train yourself to look everywhere.
And in a given year, how many do you think you acquire for your collection?
Well, that is a diminishing number because there's less that I need. I've been actively collecting the Duke books for about 4 years. So in 4 years out of 100, I found about 75, so 3/4 of them.
What will you do when you're done? How will you know when you're done?
Well, that's another interesting thing. I have another series of books that I don't have at hand now that I could show you. That was the Paizo Company. If you've ever heard of it, it was in Warren, Pennsylvania, and it was basically a snake oil company. They sold narcotic-based cure-alls, Paizo's Cure, and then as the government started to crack down on people selling poison, they morphed into, they got rid of the cannabis, they got rid of the opiates that were in it, in this witch's brew, and it eventually, in the 1930s, was just a cough syrup. But unlike the Duke cigarette, where we've got a list of titles, and we know each of the 100 books, there's really no way to know with the Paizos, or even the Winthrop Press, the storybooks that I showed you. We know there's 108 known titles, but we don't know how many unknown titles there are because, as I said, they were disposable items, so records really weren't kept for the most part on a lot of this stuff. So it's incumbent on collectors like me to build a bibliography.
Mm-hmm.
For miniature books, there's a couple of excellent reference materials. Robert Bradbury was a librarian up in Connecticut or Massachusetts, in the Northeast. And he was very active around the turn of the 21st century, and he put out 2 books, 20th Century United States Miniatures, that lists private press books. Had I been publishing 30 years ago, my books would be in there. And then he has antique United States miniature books, which spans the time from 1690, which was the first known miniature book published in what became the United States, up to 1900. So a little more than 200 years it covers. And in that he lists 60 or so different items in a miniature format that the Paizo company put out between 1879 and 1900. And then they published up to 1919, so that's not listed. And then I found about a dozen or so items that were not listed in his bibliography that Paizo put out. So there's plenty of material to keep looking for beyond what is known.
And for someone like you who's interested in developing a bibliography, are there supplements to the books you mentioned that come out and update the new things that are found? Or how do you find out what has come into the market or been discovered since a reference work like that was published?
Well, again, that falls to collectors like me. No, there haven't been supplements. There have been other types of reference works, but not really a lot since the antique book came out in 2001 as far as a comprehensive bibliography. The areas of my interest, the specific areas of my interest within the miniature book world, I'm doing the work, and I try to get a photograph and a description of everything that I find that I don't have, as well as information for what I have in my own library, and hopefully we can start doing that. The ultimate goal would be an online searchable database, specifically for miniature books.
Has anyone tried that yet, or is it an idea being given active thought by anyone?
Well, the platform, to build a platform like that is very costly. A few people have looked into it. So it's very costly, and then you run into issues of maintenance. I'm one man, I'm 49 years old. I've got a finite lifetime. What happens to that type of thing afterwards? So what we're looking for in the community is an institution, whether it's a university or a big public library, that would help us set up the platform, because we just, as individuals, can't afford that to build.
What makes it a costly undertaking?
Well, I mean, the software development.
Okay.
For the type of, I mean, there's good, very inexpensive book organizing softwares out there for the hobbyist like myself. But to make it searchable and make it something that could maybe work with WorldCat or a platform like that, it has a high level of development that's just necessary to make it function. And then to maintain it, because anybody who's been around more than 15 minutes knows that by the time you get personal software, it's already out of date because they've made something better. So it would be an ongoing issue to keep it current. So you really need the institutional backing. Mm-hmm. In fact, the local, the Rofon Club, if you're familiar with them, they've run into that problem where 20 years ago they built a database of their library, which is quite extensive, that's inaccessible now because the software doesn't run on today's machines. It's too out of date.
And for the benefit of our viewers, all of them may not know about that group. What are they?
The Rofon Club is the second oldest literary club in the United States, behind the Grolier Club in New York City. That was the first. The Rofon was the second one, established in Cleveland, I believe, in 1892. And they've sponsored fine publishing and been a cultural mainstay in Cleveland now for all these years. I believe the name comes from a English estate that had a famous library in the 19th century. So they sponsor exhibits and lectures. I'm not a member. I've been a visitor before, though.
Mm-hmm. And I guess nobody remembered that the software would need updating in the way that many of us still have big floppy disks in drawers.
Well, I'm not sure. I believe the man who put it together left the club, and it just kind of sat. And when the librarian, they've got a full-time librarian at that club, when he finally found it, too much time had passed, and it really was not functioning in a way that they could use it.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of clubs and organizations, let me segue over to the Miniature Book Society, because we have friends watching the show who come to us every week from all levels of experience and knowledge. So could you tell us a little bit about the origins of the Miniature Book Society, what it does, why people join it?
Sure. The Miniature Book Society was founded in 1983, and it's really a pretty unique organization. There's a few organizations that are similar, but it's unique in that it joins. It's not just a bibliophilic society of collectors or readers, or a society like ABBA or whatever, that's a society of booksellers, but it brings all the aspects of the miniature book world together. We have members that are publishers. We have members that only collect. We have members that are book dealers. And it was founded more or less accidentally. In the early 1980s, there was a famous publisher of miniature books in Scotland by the name of the Glenifer Press. He holds, I think, 3 or 4 world's records for the smallest book printed at that time. He wanted to come to the United States and meet publishers of miniature books, 1980 was 20 years into what we call the Renaissance period of miniature book making. In the early 1960s, there was a magazine called The Miniature Book Collector, and it spurned an interest in miniature books. And by the end of the century, there were some 150 different publishers
Golly.
that specialized in miniature books. So in the early 80s, this Ian MacDonald, his name is, wanted to come to the United States and meet other publishers and just compare notes and have some fellowship. So he contacted a miniature book publisher named Miriam Irwin in Cincinnati, Ohio, and she published specifically dollhouse-sized books. They're fully readable. I've got some here I can show you, but they're 1/12 scale, her
Yes.
books. And so what she did was sent the word out and gathered some of the best-known publishers on her family farm in Tip City, Ohio. And as collectors who didn't publish got wind of what was happening, they said, well, we want to be included too. And so they set up a second meeting for collectors, and on the final Sunday they had they all got together as a group, and they had a book fair, and this was again in 1983. And one famous bookseller's wife, she says it's a grand conclave. And so every year now, since 1983, the Miniature Book Society meets once a year in a different location. And we have a live book auction and a silent book auction. And we have a all-day book fair one day. And then we have seminars on bookmaking or book conservation. And we have maybe field trips. This past year in August, we met in Bloomington, Indiana, where the Lilly Library at the Indiana University is located, and they have what at the time was the largest collection of miniature books, was bequeathed to them in 1996. So we had an opportunity to tour their library, and we were able to be hands-on with medieval manuscripts that were miniature, and a 13th century copy of the Magna Carta in miniature. And just the whole gamut of miniature books. We were able to do that. Next year, I believe we're meeting in Tarrytown, New York, the first or second weekend in August. And we'll have an opportunity to visit the weekend getaway of Franklin Roosevelt, Hyde Park, where some of his miniature book collection still resides to this day, so that'll be interesting.
And about how many members does the society have?
I want to say currently right around 300, give or take. It's been as much as 500. Like a lot of other collecting organizations, it's getting harder to get young people, so the group is aging and the numbers are down a little bit. But we're doing different things to encourage people to take an interest in what we love. One of those is the traveling exhibit that, of course, was at the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair last year. It's currently in New York City at the New York Society Library.
How does it make its way around? Do organizations apply to you to have it come visit, or do you have to take it there?
So what happens is somebody will make contact with the exhibit coordinator, and they'll pay shipping one way. The potential host, and it'll be sent FedEx in a big shipping crate, and they set it up, and we send along literature to go with it. And then there's all kinds of different ways that it can be utilized. It was up in Connecticut a couple of years ago, and they built a whole program around it. So one of our members actually went and spoke and talked about the books in the display, and then they brought some of their own collection to talk about it as a more hands-on exhibit.
And how many books are in the exhibit? How do you decide what to send?
Well, it's a permanent exhibit that folds up into the crate, so the books generally don't change too often. The 3 books that do change on a yearly basis are winners of an annual competition that the Miniature Book Society sponsors, the Distinguished Miniature Book of the Year. And the award is given to the 3 books that most embody the high quality of bookmaking. And we have a 3-judge panel, and the judges are chosen not out of the miniature book world, but the book community in general, whether it's professors of bookmaking or different bookmakers, or in some cases, whatever people in other arts. But they're not people that have any relationship to the organization necessarily. Mm-hmm. And so after we award the award to the winners, their books go into the exhibit for a year and tour, and then they're archived at the Lilly Library, where the Miniature Book Society has its archives.
Oh. How long does it stay when the collection goes somewhere?
Well, we try to have 1 or 2 month stays. Of course, at a book fair, it's a 2-day stay. Mm-hmm. Because that's all the book fair is there. But in general, just because it's a lot of logistics, and you get better exposure if it's in a known location for a period of time. I think it's in New York up to Thanksgiving. It went to its current venue at the beginning of October.
And when it comes home, where does it live?
Well, its home has been for the past several years. Again, the Lilly Library in Bloomington. That's where the Miniature Book Society archives are. That's where 2 important collections of miniature books reside: the Ball collection and the Adamite collection. And they have full-time conservators there that can maintain the books and the case as well. In fact, their head conservator built the current exhibit that's going around now.
And what is it made of? Is it like a display case or a suitcase? Or give us a sense of what people see.
It's quite a large affair. I should have sent you pictures of it. We may do that you can throw them up on the screen at some point. But if you go to miniaturebooksociety.org, there's pictures of it on the traveling exhibit page. It's quite large. The current setup is a triptych shadow box. So it's got 3 sections that are hinged. And it sits out on a table, and the boxes are wood with a plexiglass face.
Oh.
The previous exhibit was absolutely gorgeous. It was a plexiglass box with a pyramid in it, and the books were mounted on this black Lexian pyramid. But it was not terribly roadworthy. So the hood, the plexiglass cover, had to be replaced more frequently and at a higher cost than we really liked. So we went with this new shadow box format that hopefully is more resilient to the ravages of FedEx.
And so how old is this new version now?
Just a year.
Oh.
Yeah, it made its debut at the Conclave last October 2018, and the Florida Antiquarian Book Fair actually was its first public venue.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know it caused quite a stir there. Everyone was talking about it.
Oh, that's good to hear. I like that.
Oh. So what do you see as the in the future for miniature book collecting and production? Will it continue to grow in the number of different types that are produced and people who like them? Or read the crystal ball for me.
What's the future of book collecting in general? I vacillate in my opinions. I'm old enough now that I remember pre-internet days. I started collecting in the early 1980s when we still had great booksellers in Cleveland, Kaiselgloff's and Rose's books and the old Publix. So I remember the way it was, and A.B. Bookman. And all these things are gone now. And it looked like the book was going to go away as the tablet took everything over. But I'm more optimistic today than I was 5 years ago. As far as miniature books specifically, they've always been obscure for reasons obvious and maybe not so obvious. I'm amazed at how many book dealers have no idea what I'm talking about when I ask, do you have any miniature books? Always quick to educate, and hopefully they've got them the next time I run into them. But I think that we're still on solid footing. As far as books in general, the Nook is dead, and Kindle is probably going the same way, it looks like. You see in the universities that wanted to go all digital, the students themselves rebelled. And a lot of places that were offering textbooks in an e-read format only have had to reverse course. So for at least in my lifetime, books aren't going away. And if I have any say in it, miniature books aren't going away either.
One thing that Edie has mentioned a number of times in her segment on our shows is a friend she has who makes books from tea bags.
Yes.
How do you make a tea bag into a book?
You know what? That's not something I've ever tried. His name, I believe, is Danny Ramos, D-A-N-I.
Yeah.
And I've seen them, but I have not had them.
Okay.
In Cleveland, we have a group called ABC, Altered Books Cleveland, or the Altered Book Society. ABC is Art Books Cleveland. That's a different group, I'm sorry. But the Altered Book group, they do very strange things. And I think teabag books are one of them. The whole idea is there's a lot of discarded books that really have no value as far as reading. but as a art form, they can be altered and changed to be something other than what they started as. So that's kind of interesting, and I think that the tea bag book falls under that category.
Well, I'll have to look into that. It sounds intriguing, and I think I would worry that it would end up being accidentally consumed.
Well, I think they're used tea bags actually. So the tea is gone, and it's used as a medium for art.
Oh.
I want to say that they look like they're mostly painted.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to look around for some of those and do a feature on them on the program. But we are coming to the end of our hour. I want to thank you again for your generous sharing of knowledge and time with us today. If you've come in late among our viewers, this has been Todd Sommerfeld with the Miniature Book Society up in Ohio. And he always has interesting things to talk about and to show us, and today has been no exception. We welcome all our viewers. Every week we come on at 2:30 Eastern Time on Saturday afternoons. Our shows stay up on Facebook, so you can watch them anytime you like after the live program has ended. If you ask a question to us and we don't get back to you right away, it's because the show appears on a number of different platforms or pages on Facebook, and except for our Rare Book Cafe page, if you post a question, we can't see it until we get around to going and looking at those pages. So we're certainly not trying to ignore you. We welcome all your questions and your suggestions on how to make the show better. And so we will look forward to seeing all of you again next week at the same. Actually, we will not. We will be taking Thanksgiving off. We usually do that for Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's. And it always creeps up on me and I forget, because this show has been such a routine now for going on 4 years that I think we all kind of organize our Saturdays around it. But with that said, thank you again, Todd. And